By formal introduction, Stephen is a professor of psychology at Harvard. He was mentioned in Time magazine as one of the 100 most influential people in the world. And what else can you say to introduce someone? Stephen.
Thank you so much, Rich. Thanks to all of you for coming, and thanks for the invitation to address the International Society for Intelligence Research. At first I thought that I was an unlikely choice because I'm certainly not trained as an intelligence researcher. I was trained as a cognitive psychologist, and for whom, in general, individual differences are kind of a nuisance. We have a term for them. We call them the error term. It's a good thing, Rich, that you didn't read The Language Instinct for another reason, not because of residual syntactophobia, but because The Language Instinct, my first popular book, also had one of the lines that I most regret writing, and namely, differences between individuals are so boring. Reflecting my background as a cognitive scientist, interested in what all human beings have in common, not so much in how people differ. But since then, for many reasons, I have developed reasons to regret those words. And despite myself, I guess I have become something of an intelligence writer, if not researcher. In a few years after The Language Instinct came out, for example, I wrote a foreword to Judith Rich Harris's brilliant book, The Nurture Assumption, in which she, picking up on observations first made by Robert Plomin and developed by David Rowe, that the relatively small magnitude of the component for shared environment in adult intelligence and personality has profound implications for our understanding of why children turn out the way they do, namely that parents matter less than you think and peers matter more. I thought this was such a impressive book when I saw the manuscript that I agreed to write a foreword to it and to help bring it to wider public attention. A few years after that, I wrote The Blank Slate, which Rich kindly mentioned, in which I addressed an issue that has confronted all of you, namely, why do people think there are such dangerous moral and political implications to intelligence research and more generally research on human nature, and how can these political and moral issues be intelligently addressed? A few years after that, thanks to my colleague George Church, developer of the Human Genome Project at Harvard, I became one of the first 10 people in the Personal Genome Project back in 2008, first people to have our genome sequenced and to publish the data on the internet. And this is true. Since 2009, you go to my website, and in the mandatory About section, you've got my CV and my speaking schedule, and you can look up my genome. Now, this was considered rather daring at the time. George Church knew that he was crossing boundaries when he made this invited the participants to make this information public in an era of increasing, indeed almost paranoid concern about medical privacy. The reason I agreed to do it is I knew that, or I had a strong hunch at least, that individual genomic data, at least for the time being, about a particular individual is going to be highly uninformative. And I wrote this article, cover story for the New York Times Magazine, on what it's like to have your genome sequenced. It's not as much of a novelty now as it was in 2008. But in it, I divulged, for example, that I have the gene for baldness. Now, I divulged this for a reason, namely, what does the gene for baldness mean? Well, especially in that era, what it meant is someone did a sample of 50 men and found that 40 of them were bald and had the gene, and 10 were not bald and didn't have it. And that's, quote, the gene for baldness, which has an important scientific lesson, namely that in small samples, most correlations between genes and traits are false positives. something that I then was a co-author on a paper by James Lee, who you heard from earlier today, making the case more generally. Why is it so hard to find genes associated with social science traits? Making both the methodological point that we're all familiar with that I just mentioned, namely that in anything but large samples, most associations will be false positives, but also, thanks mostly to James's very insightful work, why, based on evolutionary theory, that's exactly what you should expect, that effect sizes for most polymorphic genes are likely to be quite small. I was then a co-author on a study that was a predecessor to the one that the remarkable study that you recently heard from James, using educational level as a proxy for cognitive ability, which is, I guess, the modern euphemism for IQ. Then, most recently, I found myself again kind of blundering into intelligence research. In my book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined, this book presented numerous data suggesting that almost every measure of violence, when it is quantified, shows a tendency to go down over the course of history. That raises the psychological puzzle of why this should be, especially since many of these declines are far too rapid and far too recent to be explained by biological evolution in the sense of gene replacements. And in one section of one chapter, I followed up on a suggestion that Geoffrey Miller made to me when I first discussed the data, that perhaps the secular decrease in violence might be related to the secular increase in IQ, namely the Flynn effect. What could possibly be the connection between rising IQ scores and declining violence? The answer is we don't know, but there are a number of hypotheses that I argued in the book are worth exploring, which fall under the rubric of the escalator of reason, something that the philosopher Peter Singer had himself suggested way before the Flynn effect was known as a possible explanation for why people's circle of empathy and cooperation might have increased over the course of history. Namely, that as literacy, education, and public discourse have increased, perhaps it encourages people in general to think more abstractly and more universally. That means we rise above our parochial vantage point. It makes it harder to privilege your own interests over others just because you're you and someone else isn't. It encourages people to stand back and recognize the futility of cycles of violence and increasingly see violence as a problem to be solved rather than as a contest to be won. And in the book, I cited some data which I still consider highly preliminary, and I hope that people in this room will explore in greater depth. But that's consistent with the idea that the historical escalator of reason might be one of the causal pathways by which violence has declined. And the preliminary findings are that, simplifying greatly, but in general, people in societies with higher levels of education and measured intelligence commit fewer violent crimes, cooperate more in experimental games, have more classically liberal attitudes, so that is, opposition to racism, xenophobia, homophobia, and so on. And as Professor Rinderman has shown, 10 years down the line are more receptive to democracy, holding all other factors constant. All of this is kind of prelude to, I guess, apologizing for why I'm here, someone who at least never thought of himself as an intelligence researcher, but perhaps has become one despite himself. That having been said, none of this has anything to do with what I plan to talk to you about this afternoon. Most people like to discuss their most recent work, and I am no exception. Oh, sorry, one more connection to intelligence research that I forgot. A little more than a year ago, I wrote an article which the editors of the New Republic called "The Trouble with Harvard." The subtitle they gave it is "The Ivy League is broken and only standardized tests can fix it." So this article, for most people in this room, it's a reply to a even more popular article by William Deresiewicz that they call "Don't Send Your Kids to the Ivy League," a kind of screed against elite education. But in this article, I think for most people in this room will be somewhere between candy and pornography, because in it I make the case that the enormously expensive and stressful admissions apparatus of elite universities could profitably be replaced by a greater reliance on standardized testing, which doesn't mean accepting only on the basis of high test scores. I'd be fully in favor of some mixture of high test scores and then a lottery of people who meet some cutoff, which I think would be much more fair and equitable and cost-effective than the crazy system that we have now. What I will talk about today is my most recent book, The Sense of Style, The Thinking Person's Guide to Writing in the 21st Century, which raises the question, why should intelligence researchers care about how to write more clearly and stylishly? Well, this slide captures at least one reason. Here you see Stephen Jay Gould, Malcolm Gladwell, and David Brooks, three prominent critics of the value of intelligence research and of the major findings that I think are accepted by most people in this group. And what the three of them have in common is that they are all excellent writers. And what a lot of people who do research in intelligence have in common is, like most academics, they're not. And so in the battle for hearts and minds, I think many of us are kind of bringing a knife to a gunfight. Namely, the people who are most vociferous in proposing the idea that intelligence doesn't matter, it can't be measured, it's all an artifact of socioeconomic status, it doesn't matter above a certain low threshold, and so on. They present their case very clearly and articulately. And so I think it behooves intelligence researchers to get their side of the story out in an effective manner. Now, the Society does this to a certain extent. This is a picture of my kid sister, Susan Pinker, who a little less than a year ago was honored by the Society by the Constance Holden Award for Outstanding Journalism. And I am both proud of my sister. I endorse her book, The Sexual Paradise, and I am grateful to the Society for the more general idea of cultivating a relationship with responsible journalists who do present an accurate picture of the state of the art in individual differences research. But I think it can't just be outsourced to journalists. I think scientists and researchers, when they present their case, either when journalists call on the phone, when they discuss their research with colleagues, when they present it to undergraduates, ought to hone the craft of getting a message across clearly and stylishly. And that's the preamble to what I would like to present this afternoon. So my starting point is, why is so much writing so bad? And how can we make it better? Why do we have to suffer through so much legalese, as in the revocation by these regulations of a provision previously revoked subject to savings does not affect the continued operations? Why do we put up with academies, as in it is the moment of non-construction, disclosing the absentation of actuality from the concept in part through its invitation to emphasize in reading the helplessness of its fall into conceptuality? Why is it so hard to set the time on a digital alarm clock? Well, there's no shortage of theories, and the one that I hear most often is captured in this cartoon, where a tech writer, a boss says to a tech writer, good start, needs more gibberish. In other words, bad writing is a deliberate choice. That bureaucrats insist on gibberish to evade responsibility. Pasty-faced nerds get their revenge on the jocks who kicked sand in their faces in high school and on the girls who turned them down for dates. Pseudo-intellectuals try to bamboozle their readers with highfalutin gobbledygook, disguising the fact that they have nothing to say. Well, I have no doubt that the bamboozlement theory is true for some writers some of the time, but as a general explanation, it doesn't ring true. Because good writers can write good people can write bad prose. I think we all know brilliant scientists who do groundbreaking research on important topics. They have nothing to hide and no need to impress, but still their writing stinks. The second theory that I hear all the time is that it's digital media that are ruining the language. Google is making us stupid. The digital age stupefies young Americans and jeopardizes our future by producing the dumbest generation. Twitter forces us to think in 140 characters. Well, there is an implication of the dumbest generation theory, which is that it must have been better before the digital age. Like in the 1980s, you all remember that era when teenagers spoke in fluent paragraphs. Remember when every academic essay was a masterpiece in the art of expression, when bureaucrats wrote in plain English? You all remember that time, don't you? Or was it the 1970s? The truth is that people have been complaining about the imminent decline of the language in every era. In 1961, there was the complaint, recent graduates, including those with university degrees, seem to have no mastery of the language at all. Well, okay, that was the era of television. Maybe you have to go back to before the popularity of radio and TV, such as in 1917. Back then, though, someone wrote, from every college in the country goes up the cry, our freshmen can't spell, can't punctuate. Every high school is in disrepair because its pupils are so ignorant of the merest rudiments. Well, maybe it was better in the era of the European Enlightenment, in 1785, for example, in which someone wrote, our language is degenerating very fast. I begin to fear that it will be impossible to check it. And then there are the ancient grammar police who wrote, oh, for crying out loud, you never end a sentence with a little bird. I think a better theory comes from Charles Darwin when he wrote, man has an instinctive tendency to speak, as we see in the babble of our young children, whereas no child has an instinctive tendency to bake, brew, or write. That is, whereas speech is instinctive, writing is and always has been hard. Your readers are unknown, invisible, inscrutable to you at the time of writing. They exist only in your imagination. They can't react. They can't break in or ask for clarification. And so writing, above all, is an act of pretense, and writing is an act of craftsmanship. That leads to the question, what can we do to improve the craft of writing? For many decades, this question has had a single answer, and that is that you hand students a copy of this. The iconic Elements of Style by William Strunk Jr., a Cornell English professor, and his student E.B. White, who later became, or earlier I should say, became known as the beloved New Yorker essayist and author of the children's classics Charlotte's Web and Stuart Little. Note that both of these gentlemen were born before the turn of the century, that is, before the turn of the 20th century. Now, there's a lot of good sense in the Elements of Style. It deserves its reputation as a classic manual. It has bits of timeless advice like use definite, specific, concrete language, write with nouns and verbs, put the emphatic words at the end, and my favorite, their prime directive, omit needless words, which is an excellent example of itself. On the other hand, there are a number of reasons why the Elements of Style can't be the basis of writing advice in the 21st century. For one thing, much of the advice is obsolete. Language changes, and unless you cultivate an ear for the ongoing change, your advice can get stale very quickly. For example, in Strunk and White, you will read that to finalize is a pompous, ambiguous verb. I bet you didn't know that. But it was new in Professor Strunk's day, and so it grated on his ear, and so he outlawed it. Or, likewise, to contact is vague and self-important. Do not contact people. Get in touch with them, look them up, phone them, find them, or meet them. Now, Strunk and White did not live to see the day when you could also text them and email them and instant message them and tweet them and so on. But in particular, what they missed is the fact that to contact is actually an extraordinarily useful verb, because sometimes you don't care how one person is going to get in touch with another as long as they do so. And for those occasions, to contact is an indispensable verb. But again, it just happened to be a neologism in the 1930s. Since then, it's become unexceptionable. But if you rule out all neologisms, history will swiftly prove you wrong. Also, a lot of the advice in Strunk and White, for all its iconic status, is kind of baffling. For example, the word of people is not to be used with words of number in place of persons. That is, you may not write 6 people. Why not? Well, if of 6 people, 5 went away, how many people would be left? Answer: 1 people. Did you get that? By the same logic, you should never say, I have 6 children, or 32 teeth, or any irregular plural. Or how's this? Note that the word clever means one thing when applied to people, another when applied to horses. A clever horse is a good-natured one, not an ingenious one. The problem with traditional style advice is that it consists of an arbitrary list of do's and don'ts based on the tastes and peeves of the authors. It is not based on a principled understanding of how language works, and as a result, users have no way of understanding and assimilating the advice, and as I hope to have convinced you, much of the advice is just wrong. I think we can do better today. We can base writing advice on the science and scholarship of language, on modern grammatical theory, which represents an advance over the pedagogical grammars based on Latin, on evidence-based dictionaries, on research from cognitive science on what makes sentences easy or hard to read, and on historical and critical studies of usage. And it's these sources of information that I have tried to put together in the sense of style. It begins with a model of effective prose communication. As I mentioned, writing is an unnatural act, and good style must begin with a coherent mental model of the communication scenario. That is, how the writer imagines the reader and what the writer is trying to accomplish. And of the many models of prose, I think the most useful is one that the literary scholars Francis-Noël Thomas and Mark Turner call classic style in their book Clear and Simple as the Truth. Now, in classic style, the model of prose communication is that prose is a window onto the world. That is, the writer has seen something in the world which the reader has not yet noticed. He positions the reader so that she can see it with her own eyes. The writer and reader are equals. The goal of the writer is to help the reader see objective reality, and the style is conversation. Now, that might seem obvious, but in fact it contrasts rather sharply with a number of other models of communication, a number of other styles, which Thomas and Turner explain in turn. There's contemplative style, there's oracular style, there's practical style. But the style that most academics write in is one that they call postmodern or self-conscious style, in which the writer's chief, if unstated, concern is to escape being convicted of philosophical naivete about his own enterprise. And they explain, they elaborate. When we open a cookbook, we completely put aside and expect the author to put aside the kind of question that leads to the heart of certain philosophical traditions. Is it possible to talk about cooking? Do eggs really exist? Is food something about which knowledge is possible? Can anyone ever tell us anything true about cooking? Classic style similarly puts aside as inappropriate philosophical questions about its enterprise. If it took those questions up, it could never get around to treating its subject, and its purpose is exclusively to treat its subject. Now, I would be defying the principles of classic style if I just described it in the abstract without presenting an example. And so here's an example. It comes from an article in Newsweek by the physicist Brian Greene on the theory of inflationary cosmology and one of its implications, multiple universes. So Greene writes, if space is now expanding, then at ever earlier times the universe must have been ever smaller. At some point in the distant past, everything we now see, the ingredients responsible for every planet, every star, every galaxy, even space itself, must have been compressed to an infinitesimal speck that then swelled outward, evolving into the universe as we know it. The Big Bang theory was born. Yet scientists were aware that the Big Bang theory suffered from a significant shortcoming. Of all things, it leaves out the bang. Einstein's equations do a wonderful job of describing how the universe evolved from a split second after the bang, but the equations break down, similar to the error message returned by a calculator when you try to divide 1 by 0, when applied to the extreme environment of the universe's earliest moment. The Big Bang thus provides no insight into what might have powered the bang itself. Now, in these two paragraphs, Green explains some fairly abstract cosmology and physics, but he does it in a way that anyone can see with their own eyes. If you can imagine space expanding outward, you can run the mental movie backwards and see that it must have originated in an infinitesimal speck that then swelled outward. And even the abstruse mathematical concept of equations breaking down, he explains in a way that people can see for themselves. You can either literally pull out a calculator and punch in 1 divided by 0, and your calculator will say error. Or you can try to wrap your mind around the concept of dividing 1 into 0 parts to appreciate what the concept of equations breaking down really means. That's classic style. Now, many examples of writing advice turn out to be implications of the model behind classic prose. For one thing, the focus on classic prose is on the thing being shown, not on the activity of studying it. And academics often have trouble distinguishing them. So here's an example of the kind of prose that I and all of you read every day, and it is defiantly non-classic. I'm imagining a review article in my own field of expertise. In recent years, an increasing number of researchers have turned their attention to the problem of child language acquisition. In this article, recent theories of this process will be reviewed. Well, no offense, but not a whole lot of people are all that fascinated by how professors spend their time. A more classic way of introducing the same subject would have been, all children acquire the ability to speak and understand a language without explicit lessons. How do they accomplish this feat? A corollary is to minimize the kind of apologizing that is mandatory in academic writing. Another contrived example, but I think you'll agree is all too familiar. The problem of language acquisition is extremely complex. It is difficult to give precise definitions of the concept of language and the concepts of acquisition and the concept of children. There is much uncertainty about the interpretation of experimental data and a great deal of controversy surrounding the theories. More research needs to be done. Now, this is the kind of paragraph that could have been deleted at a stroke with no loss of content. Because classic prose gives the reader credit for knowing that many concepts are hard to define and many controversies are hard to resolve. The reader is there to see what the writer is going to do about it. Another corollary is to minimize the reflexive hedging that one finds in academic prose. The sprinkling of words like somewhat, fairly, rather, nearly, relatively, seemingly, in part, comparatively, predominantly, apparently, so to speak, presumably, in every sentence of academic prose. And the similar use of shutter quotes by which academics tend to distance themselves from common idioms. I'll give you some examples. This is from a letter of recommendation I received. She is a quick study and has been able to educate herself in virtually any area that interests her. Now, are we to interpret this sentence as saying that this young woman is a quick study, or that this young woman is a quick study, namely someone who is rumored or alleged to be a quick study but really isn't? And if she's been able to educate herself in virtually any area that interests her, are there some areas that interest her where she failed, she tried to educate herself but just wasn't smart enough? The overuse of hedges was brought home to me once when I met an old colleague at a conference who I hadn't seen in a number of years. And I asked how she was doing, and she pulled out a picture of her 4-year-old daughter. And she said, "We virtually adore her." Aww. Why the compulsive hedging? Why can't an academic even say, "We adore our daughter"? Well, there's an imperative in bureaucracies that's sometimes abbreviated CYA, cover your anatomy. But there is an alternative in vigorous prose, namely so sue me. That is, it's better to be clear and possibly wrong than muddy and, as the physicists say, not even wrong. Also, classic prose counts on the cooperative nature of ordinary conversation. The fact that when we're engaged in conversation, we naturally fill in the blanks, read between the lines, apply ordinary principles of charity, and so on. So if someone were to say, in recent years, Americans have been getting fatter, you don't hold them to the claim that every last one of the 315 million Americans have all been getting fatter. In context, you interpret it as meaning on average or in general. Now, a second bit of advice that comes from the model of classic prose is that good style keeps up the illusion that the reader is seeing a world rather than listening to verbiage. And that illusion is behind the common advice, avoid cliches like the plague. Now, because cliches can shatter the illusion that the prose is a window onto some external reality. We all are familiar with a kind of writer and speaker who talks like this. We needed to think outside the box in our search for the Holy Grail, but found that it was neither a magic bullet nor a slam dunk. So we rolled with the punches and let the chips fall where they may while seeing the glass as half full. It's a no-brainer. Now, the problem with writing by dispensing one cliche after another is that it either forces the reader to just turn off her visual brain and process the language as blah, 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 blah. Or if she does think through to what the words actually mean, she'll inevitably be tripped up by the mixed metaphors. Here's another example from a letter of recommendation. Jeff is a Renaissance man, drilling down to the core issues and pushing the envelope. It's not really clear how you can do all of those at the same time. Or how's this from an article in the New York Times? No one has yet invented a condom that will knock people's socks off. And if you don't pay attention to the content of your words, you may be eligible for membership in Awful, Americans who figuratively use literally. So it is perfectly fine to say, she literally blushed. It is much more problematic to say, she literally exploded. And it's very, very bad to say, she literally emasculated him. Third, classic prose is about the world. It's not about the conceptual tools with which we understand the world, and so it avoids the use, or at least minimizes the use of meta-concepts. These are concepts about other concepts like approach, assumption, concept, condition, context, framework, issue, level, model, paradigm, perspective, process, role, strategy, tendency, variable. Admit it, you use these words a lot. Example from an editorial in the New York Times by a legal scholar. I have serious doubts that trying to amend the Constitution would work on an actual level. On the aspirational level, however, a constitutional amendment strategy may be more valuable. Which is to say, I doubt that trying to amend the Constitution would actually succeed, but it may be valuable to aspire to it. Or here's one from an email that I got from a university official. It is important to approach this subject from a variety of strategies, including mental health assistance, but also from a law enforcement perspective. Translation, we should consult a psychiatrist about this man, but we may also have to inform the police. Fourth, classic prose narrates ongoing events. We see agents performing actions that affect objects. Non-classic prose thingifies events and then refers to the thing using a dangerous tool of English grammar called nominalization, taking a verb or an adjective and making it into a noun. Example, instead of appearing, something makes an appearance. Instead of organizing a conference, you bring about the organization of the conference. The English scholar Helen Sword calls these zombie nouns because they kind of lumber across the scene with no conscious agent actually directing the action. And they can turn prose into a night of the living dead. Example, participants read assertions whose veracity was either affirmed or denied by the subsequent presentation of an assessment word, which is to say the people saw sentences each followed by the word true or false. Subjects were tested under conditions of good to excellent acoustic isolation, which is a fancy schmancy way of saying we tested the students in a quiet room. But I Hayes that it's not just academics who write in and speak in zombie prose, it's also politicians. Here we have Florida Governor Rick Scott explaining during the Republican National Convention 2 years ago, which was threatened by a hurricane, who said, right now, there is not any anticipation there will be a cancellation. That is, right now, we don't anticipate that we will have to cancel it. And just to give equal time to Democrats and Republicans, here we have John Kerry saying, the president is desirous of trying to see how we can make our best efforts in order to find a way to facilitate, to wit, the president wants to help. And corporate consultants. A young man was interviewed by a journalist who asked him what he did for a living. And he said, I'm a digital and social media strategist. I deliver programs, products, and strategies to our corporate clients across the spectrum of communications functions. When the journalist pressed him to explain what that really was, he finally broke down and he said, I teach big companies how to use Facebook. And product engineers. Combustion heaters and portable generators used to carry the following warning language on the stickers affixed to them. Mild exposure to CO can result in accumulated damage over time. Extreme exposure to CO may rapidly be fatal without producing significant warning symptoms. Yeah, whatever. And perhaps as a result, every year several hundred Americans asphyxiated themselves and their families by running combustion heaters and generators indoors. So they finally reworded the warning to say, using a generator indoors can kill you in minutes. So classic prose can literally be a matter of life and death. Yes, literally. OK, part 2. How can an understanding of the design of language lead to better writing advice? Well, another contributor to zombie prose is the passive voice. The passive voice refers to the contrast between a sentence like the dog bit the man, which is in the active voice, and the man was bitten by the dog in the passive voice. It's well known that the passive voice is overused by academics. On the basis of the analysis which was made of the data which were collected, it is suggested that the null hypothesis can be rejected. 4 passives in 1 sentence. And lawyers, if the outstanding balance is prepaid in full, the unearned finance charge will be refunded. 3 passives in 1 sentence. And politicians. Here we have New Jersey Governor and Republican presidential candidate Chris Christie responding to an investigation which showed that some of his aides deliberately caused a massive traffic tie-up in order to punish a mayor who failed to support his bid for re-election. And he said, mistakes were made. The infamous politician's evasive passive. So it's not surprising that all of the traditional manuals warn writers away from using the passive voice. Strunk and White, for example, write, use the active voice. The active voice is usually more direct and vigorous than the passive. Many a tame sentence can be made lively and emphatic by substituting a transitive in the active voice for some such perfunctory expression as there is or could be heard. Well, I'm glad to see from the scattered titters around the room that, yes, Strunk and White used the passive voice in order to steer writers away from the passive voice. George Orwell, in his classic essay, Politics in the English Language, which together with Strunk and White is by far the most common advice on writing given to undergraduate students, wrote, a mixture of vagueness and sheer incompetence is the most marked characteristic of modern English prose. He wrote in 1946, showing that some things don't change. I list below various of the tricks by means of which the work of prose construction is habitually dodged. The passive voice is wherever possible used in preference to the active, a warning that has not 1, but 2 uses of the passive voice in a passage telling people not to use the passive voice. So what's going on? The passive could not have survived in the English language for 1,500 years if it did not serve some purpose. Why can't we do without it? The answer comes down to the very design of language. You can think of language as an app for converting a web of thoughts into a string of words. Now, the writer's knowledge can be captured in a kind of mind-wide web, what cognitive psychologists and artificial intelligence researchers call a semantic network. So here, for example, is a fragment of a semantic network that summarizes a person's knowledge of the tragic story narrated by Sophocles in Oedipus Rex. It consists of a bunch of nodes corresponding to concepts like story, kill, marry, Oedipus, Laius, a bunch of arcs connecting them, or links that correspond to relationships among concepts. And as you wordlessly ponder the story of Oedipus Rex, your mind can surf in any direction from one concept to another. All that matters in this network is how the concepts are connected to one another. They have no inherent left-to-right ordering. But what happens when you have to take some of your knowledge and externalize it in words? Well, you have to produce a sentence, and a sentence is a linear string of words. In Sophocles' play, Oedipus married his mother and killed his father. That means that there's an inherent problem that's baked into the design of language. Namely, the order of words in a sentence has to do two things at once. On the one hand, it serves as a code for meaning. It tells you who did what to whom. But at the same time, it necessarily presents some bits of information to the reader before others, and therefore it affects how the information is absorbed. In particular, the early material in the sentence naturally encodes the sentence's topic, what the sentence is about, what has been reverberating in the reader's mind based on the context up to that point. In the metaphor behind classic prose, it's the general direction in which the reader is looking. The later material in the sentence captures its focal point, what the sentence is saying. In the metaphor behind classic prose, what the reader is now being asked to notice about the world. And any prose that violates these principles, no matter how grammatically well-formed, no matter how stylish and clear, will give the general impression of discourse that's choppy or disjointed or incoherent. And that brings us to why the English language has the passive voice. It's a workaround for the rigid order of English syntax. It allows the writer to convey the same ideas, namely who did what to whom, while giving him freedom in word order. In particular, the choice between starting the sentence with the done to or the acted upon rather than the doer or the actor. And that's why avoid the passive is bad advice. Indeed, it's, as we've seen, it's impossible advice. The passive is actually the better construction when the done to or the acted upon is currently the target of the reader's mental gaze. And again, let me give you an example. This comes from the Wikipedia entry for Oedipus Rex, and it describes the revelatory scene in which the tragic backstory is revealed to the audience. So, spoiler alert. A messenger arrives from Corinth. It emerges that he was formerly a shepherd on Mount Kithaeron, and during that time he was given a baby. The baby, he says, was given to him by another shepherd from the Laius household who had been told to get rid of the child. Now you notice that this passage has three passives, and for good reason. As the description begins, our eyes are on the messenger. A messenger arrives from Corinth. So anything that subsequently happens ought to begin with the messenger, because that's who we're looking at, and thanks to the passive voice, it does. He was given a baby. Well, now our gaze is on the baby, and so the next sentence should begin with the baby, and again, the passive voice makes that possible. The baby was given to the messenger by another shepherd. Well, now another shepherd has walked onto the stage, and so the next sentence should begin with him, and again, thanks to the passive voice, it does. The other shepherd had been told to get rid of the child. Now imagine that this anonymous Wikipedia wordsmith had been corrected by a copy editor with Strunk and White in hand, who blue penciled all of the passives into the active voice. And I have had copy editors like this. Here is the result. A messenger arrives from Corinth. It emerges that he was formerly a shepherd on Mount Kithaeron, and during that time, someone gave him a baby. Another shepherd from the Laius household, he says, whom someone had told to get rid of a child, gave the baby to him. Now, I think you'll agree that this is not an improvement. We have characters that kind of parachute in out of the blue, and the readers' attention is kind of yanked back and forth from one protagonist to another. More generally, English syntax provides writers with constructions that vary in order in the string while preserving the meaning. Oedipus killed Laius. Laius was killed by Oedipus. It was Laius whom Oedipus killed. It was Oedipus who killed Laius, and so on. Writers should choose the construction that introduces ideas to the reader in the order in which she can best absorb them. Well, this brings us back to the original question, why is the passive so common in bad writing? It's because good writers narrate a story advanced by protagonists who make things happen. Bad writers work backwards from their own knowledge, writing down ideas in the order in which they occur to them. Now, they know how the story turned out, so they begin with the outcome of the event, and then they throw in the cause as an afterthought, and the passive makes that all too easy. Part 3, why should this be so hard? Why is it so hard for writers to use language to convey ideas effectively? Best explanation that I know of comes from a psychological phenomenon that goes by many names, but my favorite is the curse of knowledge. The fact that when you know something, it is extraordinarily difficult to imagine what it's like for someone not to know it. Psychologists also call it mind blindness, egocentrism, hindsight bias. And I think the most dramatic explanation comes from a well-known study that has become kind of part of the canon in developmental psychology that I think of as the M&M study. So here's how it works. 3-year-old child comes into the lab, sits down at a table. The experimenter gives him a box of M&Ms. Child opens the box and is surprised to find that instead of M&Ms, it's got pencils inside it. So he's surprised. So the experimenter puts the pencils back in the box, closes it, puts it back on the table, says to the boy, OK, well, now Jason is going to come into the room, another little boy. What does he think is in the box? And the boy will say, pencils, even though there's no way that a newcomer into the room could know what the child now knows. But once the child knows it, he can no longer recover his state of innocence of when he didn't know it. In fact, if you ask the child, well, when you came into the room, what did you think was in the box? And the child will say, pencils. Now, we adults outgrow this infirmity, kind of, a little-ish. Because many studies have shown that adults, too, are liable to the curse of knowledge. If someone knows an obscure vocabulary item, they assume that everyone else knows it. If they know the answer to a fairly arcane technical question, they will assume it's common knowledge. And in at least one study, the more experience people have in mastering a complicated gadget, like a smartphone, the less time they estimate it will take someone else to learn it, because it's also obvious to them. I think the curse of knowledge is the chief contributor to opaque writing. It simply doesn't occur to the writer that readers haven't learned their jargon, don't know the intermediate steps that just seem too obvious to mention, can't visualize a scene that's currently in the writer's mind's eye, and so the writer doesn't bother to explain the jargon or spell out the logic or supply the concrete details, even when writing for professional peers. There is a common excuse that I don't have to explain things. I'm writing for people just like me who are specialists in my field. They already know all of the abbreviations and acronyms and technical terms. The curse of knowledge implies that that is probably not true, that even when it comes to your own circle, you probably overestimate what other people know about your private lingo. Again, I will give you an example. So this is a paragraph from a journal that some of you are familiar with called Trends in Cognitive Sciences. It's one of the trends journals that is designed to present short, non-technical articles for the benefit of professional peers so that we can all keep up with one another's research. And it's from an article on consciousness. The slow and integrative nature of conscious perception is confirmed behaviorally by observations such as the rabbit illusion and its variants, where the way in which a stimulus is ultimately perceived is influenced by post-stimulus events arising several hundreds of milliseconds after the original stimulus. Now, I've been in this business for almost 40 years, and I have no idea what they're talking about. Now, I know a lot of illusions. I teach them. I start off as a perception researcher. I'd never heard of the rabbit illusion. And I know what the word stimulus means, but I have no idea what the phrase, the way in which a stimulus is ultimately perceived, refers to. So I went to my books and I found that there is an obscure phenomenon called the cutaneous rabbit illusion, which works as follows. A person sticks out his arm, closes his eyes. The experimenter taps him 3 times on the wrist, 3 times on the elbow, 3 times on the shoulder, and it feels like a continuous series of taps running up the length of the arm, kind of like a hopping rabbit, hence the rabbit illusion. Well, why didn't they just say that? Not only is it no less scientific to describe a phenomenon in concrete, perceptual, visible terms, but it's more scientific, because now that I know what the cutaneous rabbit illusion consists of, I can follow the logic, which in this case is that the brain doesn't track the order of events in real time, but is constantly editing memories of events retrospectively to make them more coherent or higher in probability. Knowing that, I can now, as a scientist, challenge that explanation, or at least evaluate it, and think of whether there might be some alternative explanation to whether that really does show the slow and integrative nature of conscious perception, something that I, as a scientist, couldn't do if it's just described as stimulus this and post-stimulus that. So the danger of excessive abbreviation among specialists, I think, is best captured by an old joke, which I will share with you. So a man walks into a Catskills resort and goes into the dining room, and he sees a group of retired Borscht Belt comedians sitting around a table, and he joins them. And one of the comedians says, 37, and the others burst out into uproarious laughter. Another one says, 112, and again, they're just falling off their chairs, like doubling over in laughter. And he can't figure out what's going on. So he asks the guy next to him, he says, what's happening here? And the guy says, well, these old timers, they've been around each other for so long that they all know the same jokes. So to save time, they've given them all numbers. And now all they have to do is recite the number. The guy thinks that's ingenious. I'll try it. So he says, 51. Stony silence. Tries again. 27. Everyone stares at him. No one laughs. So he kind of sinks back down into a seat, and he asks the guy next to him, what happened? What did I do wrong? The guy said, it's all in the timing. How do we exercise the curse of knowledge? Well, the traditional solution is to keep in mind the reader over your shoulder, to empathize with your reader, to try to get inside their head, to walk a mile in their shoes, to feel their pain. And I think this is good advice as far as it goes, but it doesn't really go far enough, because a large number of studies in social and cognitive psychology show that we're not all that good at guessing other people's knowledge, even when we just try really, really hard. Trying hard isn't enough. There's no substitute for actually getting a reader and showing them a draft and seeing if they can follow it. It's only then that one can discover that what's obvious to you may not be obvious to anyone else. You can even let enough time pass so that the draft is no longer familiar and show it to yourself. If you're like me, you will find yourself saying, what did I mean by that? Or that doesn't follow. Or all too often, who wrote this crap? And then to rewrite several times with a single goal, making the prose understandable to the reader. That is, at some point, terminate the process of just getting your ideas down on the page and devote all of your cognitive resources to trying to make the prose more comprehensible to a third party. Finally, how should we think about correct usage? The issue that by far attracts the most attention and the most emotion when it comes to good writing. Now, some usages of syntax and vocabulary are clearly wrong. When Cookie Monster says, "Me want cookie," even a 3-year-old can laugh knowing that Cookie Monster has made a grammatical error. Likewise, ICANN has cheeseburger. The humor in lolcats, or internet memes, such as it is, depends on our universal feeling of superiority over cats because of their alleged propensity to make grammatical errors. Is our children learning? Even former President George W. Bush admitted that this was a grammatical error in a self-deprecating speech he gave, in which he reviewed a number of his fractured attempts with the English language. However, there are other cases of usage that are not so clear. And again, just to be nonpartisan, I will give you a quote from former President Bill Clinton when he was running for office in 1992. One of his campaign slogans was, "Give Al Gore and I a chance to bring America back." The notorious between you and I error. The purists, the school teachers, would say it should be give Al Gore and me a chance to bring America back. Another Democratic president, Barack Obama, said no American should ever live under a cloud of suspicion just because of what they look like. The singular they error. To boldly go where no man has gone before. Some of the pedants out there would say that he committed the error of splitting an infinitive. The Beatles. You think you lost your love? Well, I saw her yesterday. It's you she's thinking of, and she told me what to say. Anyone spot the grammatical error there? Ending a sentence with a preposition. Many of you remember Dick Cavett, the suave, urbane, intelligent talk show host, the favorite of all of the academics and intellectuals. Well, in a recent article in the New York Times talking about his college reunion, he wrote, "Checking into the hotel, it was nice to see a few of my old classmates in the lobby." Anyone go to school before the 1970s and recognize the grammatical error there, or supposed error? Displaced modifier, aka dangling participle. Well, it's disputed usages like this that have given rise to what journalists sometimes call the language war between the prescriptivists on one side and the descriptivists on the other. According to this construction, prescriptivists prescribe how people ought to speak and write. They are also known as the purists, sticklers, pedants, peevers, snobs, snoots, nitpickers, traditionalists, language police, usage nannies, grammar Nazis, and the gotcha gang, according to whom rules of usage are objectively correct. To obey them is to uphold standards of excellence. To flout them is to dumb down literate culture, degrade the language, and hasten the decline of civilization. On the other side, we have the people who describe how people do speak and write, according to whom rules of usage are just the secret handshake of the ruling class, and the people should be liberated to write however they please. Now, I think there are many reasons to believe that the so-called language war is a pseudo-controversy. If this were an accurate way of framing the issue, then the prescriptivist should have insisted that the lyrics to the Beatles song should have been, "It's you of whom she's thinking." And the descriptivists would have to admit that there is nothing wrong with "I can has cheeseburger," in which case they would have undermined the whole point of the lolcats. I argue that we need a more sophisticated way of thinking about usage than this dichotomy. So what are rules of usage? They're certainly not logical truths that you could prove in the predicate calculus, nor are they officially regulated by dictionaries. There is a widespread misunderstanding that dictionary editors are kind of like the rules committee of Major League Baseball, that they legislate what is the correct or incorrect use of a word or construction. And I can speak with some authority here because I'm the chair of the usage panel of the American Heritage Dictionary. And when I assumed this role, I asked the editor-in-chief of the dictionary, so I've always wondered, how do you guys decide what goes into the dictionary? And his answer was, we pay attention to the way people use words. In other words, when it comes to usage, there's no one in charge. The lunatics are running the asylum. So how do we make sense of these rules of usage? They are what are best described as tacit evolving conventions. Now, a convention is a way of doing something that has no merit other than the fact that everyone else is doing it the same way. So an example is the use of paper currency. A green piece of paper with a president's face on it is valuable only because everyone else expects that everyone else treats it as valuable. Or driving on the right as opposed to driving on the left. In England, they drive on the left, but there's nothing sinister or gauche or socialist about that choice. Its value is simply that everyone agrees to do it the same way. Now, unlike the rules of traffic or of currency, the rules of language are tacit. No one decides on them. They emerge as a rough consensus within a community of careful writers without explicit deliberation, agreement, or legislation, and they evolve. That consensus can change over time, as we saw in the case of verbs like to finalize and to contact. So what's a writer to do? Should writers pay attention to these rules? And the answer is it depends. There's some rules that just extend the logic of everyday grammar to more complicated cases. So what's wrong with "is our children learning"? Why did even George W. Bush admit that this is a grammatical error? Why did even the Microsoft Word spell checker flag this sentence with the incriminating green wiggly line? Well, it's because "is our children learning" is based on "our children is learning," which immediately jumps off the page as a grammatical error. Just that it's easy to get confused when you turn the statement into a question. Or here's a more subtle one. The impact of the cuts have not been felt yet. Again, green wiggly line. What's going on? Well, when you think about it, this sentence is an elaboration of the impact have not been felt yet. Subject of the sentence is impact, not cuts. And so it should be the impact of the cuts has not been felt yet. But the writer's attention was momentarily distracted by the presence of the plural noun sitting cheek by jowl with the verb. Also, there are some rules of correct usage that make important semantic distinctions. You'd be well advised not to thank someone for their fulsome compliments or to thank the introducer for his fulsome introduction. Fulsome is not a fancy schmancy way of saying full. It means insincere or unctuous or excessive. Likewise, you'd be well advised not to praise someone on their simplistic theory. Simplistic is not a synonym for simple. Nor should you praise someone by calling them meretricious instead of meritorious. You could look it up if it's not clear. In general, if you try to use a hoity-toity word that you think is more posh than one that you know, you will be in danger of eliciting the reaction that the character Vicini in The Princess Bride elicited when he kept using the word inconceivable to refer to things that just happened. Namely, you keep using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means. On the other hand, not every pet peeve, bit of grammatical folklore, or dimly remembered lesson from Miss Thistlebottom's classroom is a legitimate rule of usage. And it turns out that many supposed rules of usage violate the grammatical logic of English, are routinely flouted by the best writers, and have always been flouted by the best writers. A prime example being singular they, as in Obama's "no American should be under a cloud of suspicion because of what they look like." Now, an article, an angry opinion piece came out in the Weekly Standard in which the author said that the use of singular they was a mutilation of the English language that has been forced down our throats by angry radical feminists in search of a gender-neutral pronoun, and that we should defy this politically correct engineering and return to the crystalline prose of Jane Austen. Whoops. Turns out that Jane Austen used singular they 87 times in her novels, as in everybody began to have their vexation. And if you think there's something wrong with a preposition at the end of the sentence, maybe you know better than Shakespeare when he wrote, "We are such stuff as dreams are made on." And the same is true of split infinitives, dangling participles, between you and I, and a lot of the other bogus rules of usage. In fact, obeying these rules not only fails to make prose better, it can make it much worse. Here is a bit of publicity that I got in a press release from, of all places, my employer, Harvard University. David Rockefeller has pledged $100 million to increase dramatically learning opportunities for Harvard undergraduates. Now, this writer bent himself into such a pretzel to avoid a split infinitive that he came out with a string of words that I submit does not belong in the English language. In fact, not only can obeying bogus rules make prose worse, but it can literally bring on a crisis of governance. Literally. In 2009, Chief Justice John Roberts, who is a notorious grammatical stickler, discharged his constitutional duty of administering the oath of office to President-elect Barack Obama. And according to the Constitution, the mandated verbiage was, I, Barack Obama, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States. Now, Roberts' inner copy editor spotted a split verb in this verbiage, and so he unilaterally amended the Constitution, abandoning his strict constructionism. And he had Obama say, I, Barack Obama, do solemnly swear that I will execute the office of President of the United States faithfully, which is not only not a stylistic improvement, but it called into question the legitimacy of the transfer of power. And so they had to repeat the oath of office in a private ceremony later that afternoon. If you thought the birthers were bad, just imagine if Obama had never been sworn in according to the wording of the Constitution. So how should a careful writer distinguish the legitimate rules of usage from the bogus ones? And the answer is unbelievably simple. Look them up. If you look up split infinitive in the Merriam-Webster Unabridged Dictionary, it will tell you it's all right to split an infinitive in the interest of clarity. Since clarity is the usual reason for splitting, this advice means merely that you can split them whenever you want to. In Carta, there is no grammatical basis for rejecting split infinitives. American Heritage Dictionary, the only rationale for condemning the construction is based on a false analogy with Latin, and so on. Every dictionary will tell you there is nothing wrong with splitting an infinitive, and so on for the other bogus rules. Modern dictionaries and style manuals do not ratify pet peeves or grammatical folklore, and that's because their advice is based on evidence, on practices of contemporary good writers, on practices of the best writers in the past, on polling data from a panel of writers for contested cases, and that's the usage panel at the American Heritage Dictionary that I chair, and on their effects on clarity and their consistency with the grammatical logic of English. Also, correct usage should be kept in perspective. I've mentioned that it is the aspect of writing that by far attracts the most attention and the most emotion. But in fact, it's, although I think the legitimate rules of usage are well worth following, you should not sound like Cookie Monster or George W. Bush, but they're still the least important part of good writing. They're far less important than maintaining classic style, coherent ordering of ideas, overcoming the curse of knowledge, to say nothing of factual diligence and sound argumentation. And for that matter, even the most irksome errors, the nails on a chalkboard errors, are not signs of the decline of the language. And this was brought home in a wonderful XKCD cartoon by Mandel Monroe, in which he shows a purist being awakened in the middle of the night by the specter of a ghost who brings a cautionary vision of things to come. This is the future. And this is the future if you give up the fight over the word literally. And as you can see, they're exactly the same. So in sum, I have suggested that modern linguistics and cognitive science provide better ways of enhancing our writing, ways that all researchers, but particularly researchers in intelligence, are well advised to attend to. A model of prose communication, namely classic style in which language is a window onto the world. An understanding of the way that language works, in particular the way that it converts a web of ideas into a linear string of words. A diagnosis of why good prose is so hard to write, namely the curse of knowledge. And a way to make sense of rules of correct usage, namely as tacit evolving conventions. Thank you.